In this video, you'll see how I created all 6 of these resin wood-turned eggs. I started off with some 3D prints that I painted kind of carefully. Some of them were detailed and some of them not so much, yet through the bubbles you couldn't see it that well towards the end. But I mixed up a base color for each figure to stand on, and that was corresponding with whoever I was making it for. And so it was either their favorite color or just like a color that would go well with the theme. And for that one, it was like a galaxy, so I added some glitter as stars. And I did 2 of them with glitter, and the rest were pearl pigments, and some were a little bit of alcohol ink as the dye. And so I glued in these figures on some of them where the resin was already cured, but for the most part, some of them were still sticky, so they could just glue themselves. It wasn't that hard. I just kind of slipped my hands in there, but sometimes it was kind of hard to reach in. You could see how some of them were centered and some of them weren't centered. And the 3D prints, like that one there, I used super glue and baking soda, and you'll see this reaction it makes later on. But that one you could see I needed to glue down. So I had some Gorilla Glue to do that. The Master Chief, I did that. The figure looked really well. I just wish the detail was captured. The exciting part here, I got to mix up about 1 gallon of Alumilite resin. And so I did that by having like 6 ounces of each part and then a whole bottle of each part. So I mixed all of that. You could see that I mixed it just a second ago. It was clear, and then I whipped a whole bunch of bubbles, which I shouldn't have done. I should have just mixed it slow, but I don't know what I was thinking. I scraped the sides and edges and everything, and then it got pouring. You could see how white that was. If I had a pressure pot or vacuum chamber, I could have degassed the resin or pressure casted it, but that was just my process of putting it in the sun and torching it, just to remove some bubbles. And so I set them in the sun to cure, because I found that kind of helps the bubbles and cures the process, speeds up the process of curing. You could see it was pretty foggy, and then here I went with the blowtorch, which I really should not have. You really want to give it time just to cure. You don't want to speed up the process, because that can really like add more bubbles and everything. So just don't do what I was doing here. But I noticed it was starting to clear up, and I found some bubbles in the overhangs and underhangs, I guess you could say, of some of the pieces. And so I just kept going back and forth. But then the next day, I found that the super glue and baking soda, or just all the super glue, had turned yellow. I don't know why that happened. It was a chemical reaction. And then I also noticed these bubble rings around it. It's almost like a ring of just bubbles from the resin. And I think that was because the top was torched and it cured, and some of the air was going upwards to escape when it got trapped there. And so I marked it so I could drill a hole. But you could see that the good blinks for turning, they came out clear. Well, some of them clear. They looked really good. I was really happy with that. Some of them came out better than the others. But it was just a fun experience to try this. You could see some bubbles that riz out of that one. And so I drilled a hole there connecting to the ring of bubbles, and just the connection, like a tunnel of bubbles. I drilled a hole, and then I mixed up a small batch of resin so I could pour in there. It was actually kind of tough to pour in because I had to use like a toothpick. You could see that resin right. As for the turning segment of it, I tried to get it as centered as I could. And then I just started turning on a normal speed. I used a rough and gouge and a skew mainly to kind of shape it better. And you can see how I kind of got the rough shape, and then I started about 1/3 in. I started getting closer in towards the tailstock, and so that would create the egg point, like the shape at the top. Some of these I took a lot of time just to get rounded, and some of them not so much, so it was very inconsistent. But it was just pretty fun to try out new turning techniques. I kind of made it up as I went, but you can see how I sanded that with some 60 grit, then 80 grit, and then 120 grit, and then wet 120. And then wet 220 and 320, I think. I did that for all of them, and then I used this plastic polish as well as a like auto like car windshield protector thing on it, which didn't do much, but you could see the turning and sanding of that one. It came out really clear. That one was probably one of the best ones besides the rubber ducky. This rubber duck one was like, I think it was the most fun one, because for some reason the resin was so easy to turn. I think because it was clear, and the bottom, you could see how that turned really blue, the shavings. That's because it wasn't a pigment. I think it was just the actual dye that made it like that. And so you could see the process there, how I kind of made it short at the top. This one was a little tricky to get centered and kind of roughed out, but I didn't film the other ones because I thought that would take too long. But for the most part, I just did the same similar process, and they all came out looking pretty good, and it was really fun. It was a fun project to try something new and to really practice all this turning and all these different techniques. Casting too, I learned as I went. Here's how they look. Yeah, you could see how some turned out foggier than others. I'm gonna say the bottom row is probably the best row, and the top one on the right hand side, the very right hand side of the top row, that's probably the best ones. But yeah, it was pretty fun to do. Hope you enjoyed it, and have a good Easter.